Welcome to the deep dive. We're jumping straight into something impacting, well, pretty much everyone across Ireland right now, the housing market.
Absolutely. And today we're really focusing in on Ireland in 2025. We've gathered quite a stack of material, reports, analyses, hard data from property sites, and even looking at some of the chatter online, the candid stuff people are sharing.
Yeah, exactly. And our goal in this deep dive is to try and sift through all that for you, find the essential nuggets on supply, demand, and crucially, this huge challenge of affordability that keeps coming up in all these sources.
And you really feel that challenge when you look at some of the numbers. I mean, one report flags that the average house price is now, what, roughly 8 times the average income?
Right, yeah. That average income being around 51,000 or maybe $55,800. So that 8-to-1 ratio, it's called out as one of the biggest affordability gaps we've seen recently. It's pretty stark.
Or, take a concrete example mentioned in the material, like, say, a one-bedroom apartment in Swords, just outside Dublin. After the crash, post-2008 low, maybe it was 75,000.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay, fast forward to now, 2025, and that same apartment, it's looking closer to 300,000 fine.
Wow. A 500% increase over that time for just one type of apartment in one specific area. It really hammers home the scale of these price shifts.
It does. It paints this picture of, well, persistent price growth and just major hurdles. But as some of the analyses hint, the market might be entering a different phase now, potentially some changes coming.
Okay, let's unpack that picture then. What does it look like right now in 2025? The sort of baseline across everything we've seen is prices in Ireland have kept rising.
They definitely have. And the data gives us a pretty clear sense of the pace. Looking at property reports, average prices nationally went up by, 3.7% just in the first quarter of this year.
And if you look year on year, so comparing now to this time last year, that growth hit 8.7% back in December 2024. That was just slightly down from a peak of 9.6% the month before in November.
Right. But here's where it gets interesting, and maybe suggests that slowdown you mentioned. By March 2025, that year-on-year figure had actually eased back a bit to 7.5%.
Okay.
That's down from 8% in February. Yeah. And that slowing is noted as the slowest year-on-year growth we've seen since March 2024. So a potential shift in momentum.
So price is still climbing, definitely, but maybe, just maybe, not quite as steeply as, say, 6 months ago. And we're also seeing differences based on the type of property, right?
Oh, absolutely. Detached houses, for instance, they've seen stronger year-on-year growth around 9%. That's still over 7.5%, even when you factor in inflation. Apartments, though, they've seen, let's say, more modest increases compared to houses.
And location, as they say.
Yeah.
Dublin is still by far the most expensive place to buy.
Oh, yeah. Average prices there were pushing past 600,000 towards the end of last year.
Wow.
And other cities, Cork, Galway, Limerick, also dealing with really high prices.
Okay.
Rural areas, generally cheaper, sure, but they've got their own issues, mainly around, very limited supply.
And bringing it back to that Swords example, that 75K to 300K jump, it's not just some random number. It really illustrates those dramatic, localized spikes that have happened, especially in places within commuting range of Dublin. Puts a face on the stats, doesn't it?
It really does. So, yeah, the current picture is continued growth,
Yeah.
maybe moderating slightly, but huge variations depending on where you are and what kind of place you're after.
Which naturally leads us right to the absolute core of the issue that screams out from all the material, this affordability crisis.
Exactly. Those price increases just haven't kept pace with wage growth for most people.
Yeah.
That's what creates that massive affordability gap. We mentioned prices 8 times average income. It's flagged everywhere as a major, major problem.
And who's feeling it the most? The analyses are pretty consistent on this. It's first-time buyers and, younger generations are finding it incredibly tough to even get a foot on the property ladder.
And what's really interesting, or maybe worrying, is how this pressure cooker effect spills over into the rental market.
Yeah.
Because buying is so hard.
Yeah.
More people are forced into renting for longer, which just pushes up demand there. And boom, rents hit historic highs too. Average rents in Dublin cited as $1,900 a month, maybe even higher in some parts.
Yeah, and you see this reflected in sort of public discussions too. Like we saw material mentioning someone sharing their story online, paying €2,500 a month in rent, even though they have what most would call a good, above average salary.
Exactly.
It just shows how deep this goes, affecting even people who seem to be doing okay financially.
It's become this really tough cycle. Can't afford to buy, so you rent. But then renting gets more expensive because everyone else is in the same boat and there aren't enough places there either.
Okay, so high prices, massive affordability gap, record rents. Let's try and dig into the why. What are the drivers behind all this, according to the sources?
Well, the number one factor pointed to consistently is just a chronic shortage of housing supply. I mean, fundamentally, Ireland isn't building nearly enough homes for the number of people who need them. New construction numbers, even with government efforts we might talk about later, they just aren't meeting the demand, especially in and around cities like Dublin.
And on the other side of the equation, the demand side, we're seeing things like uh, strong population growth, people continuing to move towards urban centers, and inward migration, too. That's both Irish people coming back and international arrivals.
Yeah, and some of the public discussion captured in the material does touch on perspectives linking migration policies specifically to demand pressures, maybe particularly in the rental sector. It's worth noting the sources often frame these claims as, reflecting genuine public feeling, but maybe lacking comprehensive data to fully pin down the exact scale of the impact across the whole market.
Gotcha. Another piece mentioned is the credit and lending environment, right? Like in past years, maybe looser standards and those super low interest rates allowed people to borrow more.
Definitely. Lower rates and easier credit absolutely fuel demand, allowing bigger bids and pushing prices up.
But there's a potential shift there, too.
Yeah, the big caveat now is the potential for future interest rate hikes from the European Central Bank. Fighting inflation. Higher rates mean higher borrowing costs, which could definitely dampen demand and maybe put the brakes on price growth eventually.
And then there are the wider economic factors. Ireland's had a pretty strong economy, right? Driven by multinationals, the tech sector.
Exactly. Which means higher disposable incomes for some people, and that supports those high prices, especially in the really desirable areas.
But the flip side, also discussed in the material, is that general inflation, the rising cost of living, is hitting middle and lower income households really hard, making affordability even worse for them.
So it's this complex mix, isn't it? Not enough building, more people needing homes, the legacy of past lending, and an economy that's, well, strong in parts, but also creating cost pressures that squeeze many people out.
Let's look beyond just the price tags. What about the broader impact, the social consequences? The material paints a pretty stark picture there, too.
It really does. That struggle for first-time buyers we keep mentioning, it's not just about the price. They're often getting outbid, sometimes by cash buyers or, investment funds who can move faster.
And just scraping together the deposit needed for today's prices,
Yep.
it's a huge hurdle in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And it leads directly to situations where you see lots of young adults, maybe in that 18 to 29 bracket particularly, they're still living at home with their parents. Not necessarily by choice, but because moving out, renting, or buying just isn't financially feasible.
And tragically, the crisis also impacts the most vulnerable. Some materials we looked at include estimates suggesting around 15,000 people are currently experiencing homelessness in Ireland. It's a really serious social challenge linked to this.
And all of this, understandably, fuels a lot of public discontent. You see that frustration bubbling up strongly in online discussions, social media, public commentary.
Yes, there's widespread frustration directed at government policies or perceived lack of effective policy. Some of that public sentiment, as captured in the sources, points fingers at factors like immigration levels or foreign investment, seeing them as making the crisis worse.
Right, and the material notes that while these views reflect real public anger, they often represent, let's say, simplified takes on very complex dynamics and maybe lack the full data backing. But it's definitely part of the public conversation we're seeing reported.
So the housing situation isn't just about economics. It's really hitting social structures hard and generating significant public anger and frustration.
Given how stretched things feel, the big question that comes up is, could prices actually come down? Is a decline possible? And some analyses do float this idea.
They do. The Banking and Payments Federation Ireland, the BPFI, they're cited as predicting that average house prices might actually start to fall, perhaps relatively soon, maybe sometime in 2025 or heading into 2026.
And what are they basing that on?
Well, factors like those affordability limits we've talked so much about, things just become unsustainable. Plus, potential headwinds for the wider economy, maybe slowing things down overall.
And that slight easing in year-on-year growth we mentioned earlier, dropping from 8% to 7.5%. That could be seen as an early sign. Maybe the market is losing some steam, approaching a peak before a potential correction.
It's useful to remember the history here, isn't it? Ireland went through that absolutely brutal housing crash between, 2007, 2013. Prices basically halved from the peak.
Yeah, a dramatic drop. Analyses now are generally quick to say, look, the current situation is different. A crash on that scale isn't really anticipated this time around.
Okay.
If declines do happen, the expectation seems to be something more moderate, maybe, drops more like the 20–30% range seen in other comparable markets having corrections, because the underlying economic factors like lending standards are quite different from the pre-2008 bubble days.
And there are those external factors that could definitely nudge the market one way or the other. We see mentions of potential global trade issues, maybe Trump tariffs if that happens again, impacting Ireland's very open export-driven economy.
hmm And crucially, as we touched on, those rising interest rates from the ECB. If mortgages get significantly more expensive, that could really cool demand and contribute to prices easing off or even declining.
So the outlook is uncertain. There's a potential for a correction suggested by some forecasts, but the timing and the scale really depend on how these domestic affordability pressures interact with those bigger global economic forces.
Okay, what about the policy response then?
Yeah.
What are governments actually doing according to the material, and how's it being received?
Well, the sources mention things like the Help to Buy scheme, which is aimed at helping first-time buyers with their deposits. And there's talk of increased government funding for building social and affordable housing.
Right, but how effective are these seen to be?
That's where the criticism comes in, and it's quite strong in much of the material. The general view reported is that these measures are just insufficient. They're not really tackling the crisis at the scale required.
Yeah, I saw that too.
You even see pointed quotes reflecting this, like one from Sinn Féin's housing spokesperson, A.O. O'Brien. He's quoted calling the situation, I think it was very depressing but not surprising, and basically criticizing the government's ability to actually deliver affordable homes beyond just announcing plans.
Hmm. And that feeds back into that wider public frustration we talked about.
Yeah.
There's clear dissatisfaction directed at the current governing parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, with accusations in public discourse that they haven't prioritized housing enough, maybe focusing on other things.
And the policy debate, as reflected in some sources, also includes those more controversial ideas bubbling up from public concern, like calls to, say, restrict foreign investment in residential property or maybe implement caps related to immigration to try and ease demand pressure. These are obviously really divisive points being debated.
So it sounds like the government is taking some steps, but the overwhelming sentiment captured in the sources is that it's not nearly enough. Public pressure is intense, and the debate is widening to include some pretty contentious policy ideas.
Which brings it all right back to you, the listener, maybe trying to navigate this whole thing. The material really frames this as a tough decision. Should you try and buy now, or is it better to wait?
Okay, so what are the arguments presented for jumping in now?
Well, one perspective highlighted is that buying now could mean locking in a price before it potentially goes up even more, especially if those supply problems just don't get fixed quickly. And maybe you could snag a mortgage rate now that might be lower than what's coming down the line if rates keep rising.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And the case for holding off, for waiting.
Waiting might align with those BPFI forecasts suggesting prices could dip, potentially offering better value in, say, 2026 or beyond. Plus, if those wider economic uncertainties trade issues, higher rates really do cool the market significantly, waiting could seem like the smarter play.
But waiting has its own risks, doesn't it? It's not a sure bet.
Oh, absolutely not. That supply shortage, it could easily persist, meaning prices might not drop much, or they could even just keep creeping up, maybe just more slowly. Waiting could mean you end up paying more later, or find it even harder to get a place.
So the really strong takeaway coming through all the material is that there's no single right answer here. It absolutely requires weighing up your own personal financial situation very carefully.
Exactly.
Looking at the specific location you're interested in, because we saw how much variation there is, and keeping a close eye on those broader market trends and economic shifts we've discussed.
And for first-time buyers specifically, some suggestions mentioned are things like, well, definitely explore any government schemes available, even with the criticism, see if they help you, and maybe, just maybe, consider looking at less competitive regional markets if that's an option for your life and work.
So for you, listening to this, considering all these factors, this whole complex picture painted by the reports, the data, the discussions, what does this deep dive suggest is really crucial for you to weigh up when making your own decision about buying or waiting?
Ultimately, it seems to boil down to balancing that possibility of future price changes, which are uncertain, against your own immediate housing needs and what you can realistically, comfortably afford right now. And accepting that the future path is tied to so many factors, some quite unpredictable.
Right. So just to quickly wrap up this deep dive then, Ireland's housing market in 2025, it's defined by these incredibly high prices, a really severe lack of supply, and consequently major affordability challenges hitting a huge swath of the population.
Yeah, and it's driven by that messy combination of not enough building, strong demand from various sources, underlying economic conditions, and the history of lending. And while prices are still technically rising, we are seeing some signals that slowing growth rate, certain forecasts that hint at the possibility of a market shift or maybe future declines.
But the core, systemic problems, they run deep. And public frustration is running very high, fueling intense debates about current policies, and even pushing more controversial ideas into the mainstream discussion.
And we've tried to bring you insights from all sorts of places today. Those official reports, property site data, economic analyses, and even reflections of public sentiment from online spaces, always aiming to just relay what the material presented impartially.
So as we finish up, maybe here's something to mull over. If really fixing Ireland's housing crisis means not just building way more homes, but also navigating these really sensitive, sometimes divisive debates around demand drivers like migration or the role of big investors, what kind of combination of actions, drawing on the data, the forecasts, and that whole spectrum of public feeling we've touched on, could actually start to tackle this challenge on the scale that seems necessary?
A huge question. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.